I think it's fair to say that cultivating a practice of radical empathy was crucial for me as I wrote Out of Nowhere. And it's a practice that I try to utilize in all of my novels. Some of you may be wondering what the heck empathy has to do with writing and wondering what I even mean by empathy, because oh, isn't it just another word for sympathy? And of course, the answer to that is no, it is not another word for sympathy. And I do have a fun little video that I would like to share. So now this is when we have to do screen sharing and hope the technology works out. Sort of really highlights that difference between empathy and sympathy. So I'm going to see if we can do this here. Share screen. Share. Boom. And there we go.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Okay. So I love that little video. I first, can you hear me? Did that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That video was by Professor Brene Brown, who's a researcher and professor at, in Texas. I first encountered it when I was training with Narrative 4 to be a storytelling facilitator. For those of you unfamiliar with it, Narrative 4 is a nonprofit that's founded by author Colin McCann, and it works primarily through schools, bringing students together from different backgrounds and experiences for story exchanges. The whole point of these exchanges is to create empathy, to connect people, to open minds, and to possibly create lives. We take the kids and we put them together, and each one of them shares a personal narrative with the other. And then in front of an audience, they switch. And each one tells the other person's story from their point of view. It's a remarkably powerful thing to have to embody and tell another person's story and convey those emotions as if they were your own. But that is the practice of story exchange and radical empathy. I'm a great believer in the power of stories to accomplish these things, to create empathy, to connect people, to open minds, and to possibly even change lives. And I think that goes for whether you're telling a story or hearing a story, whether you're writing it, whether you're reading it, whether you're meeting people in real life or meeting them on the page. See, when I realized that Professor Brown was describing empathy as the ability to take the perspective of another person, that's precisely what you do when you create a narrator in a novel, or you create a character and attempt to see the world through their eyes. She says that empathy involves feeling with people, and that in order to do that, you have to connect with something within yourself that knows that person's feeling. And that goes right to the heart of all that tried and true advice we get as a writer: write what you know. Now, I always amend that when I go and teach writing workshops to kids. And I said, if I only wrote what I know, I would write about emptying the dishwasher, balancing the checkbook, and taking the garbage out. And frankly, that doesn't make for a very interesting young adult novel. So I tell kids, write what you know is emotionally true. Dig deep, be honest. And the chances are you will tap into something universal that connects you to others. One of my favorite books about writing is by one of my favorite authors, Anne Lamott, and she's written a book called Bird by Bird. If you haven't read this book, I highly recommend it if you want a good laugh, and also if you want some really good writing advice. Bear with me right now because I'm going to switch again to slides and share with you some of the best writing advice I ever got from Bird by Bird. So let's do another screen share and see if this works. How's that doing? Can you see it?
Yep.
Oh, hooray. Okay. So this is the cover, Bird by Bird, some instructions on writing and life. And there you see the best writing advice I've ever gotten, which is plot follows character. Now, what does that mean? Kids are always asking me, where do you get your ideas? How do you come up with a plot? And the answer I always give them is, it starts with a character. You have a person who's telling the story, or who's the main character in the story, and you have to get to know them, which I know sounds really weird, right? Because these are imaginary people and you're making them up. How do you get to know them? But as a writer, you do. You get out your journal and you make all sorts of notes about your character, about their motivations, their friends, favorite foods, greatest fears. What do they want? What do they need? What's at the bottom of their backpack? What's in their pockets? I do workshops where we figure all these things out. And as you get to know these characters, you listen as they speak. You listen as if they're actual people, and you engage in the act of listening, which is the heart of radical empathy. And as you absorb who they are and share their feelings as they tell their stories, plot happens. Your characters begin to just do things. Action happens. And the next thing you know, you're writing a book. If this sounds like magic, frankly, it kind of is. Ooh, I'm not able to advance my advance my slide for some reason. Do we know why that is? Oh, there it is. Okay, we're going to do it that way. Never mind. Okay, so radical empathy involves a little more than just feeling and identifying with others. It also involves changing our perspectives, maybe seeing things differently, maybe seeing some things for the first time. Radical empathy also requires active listening. And this is listening so hard and so carefully that you could actually repeat that story as if you were that person and convey the same emotion. As an author, I use active listening not only when I'm getting to know my imaginary characters, but also when I'm researching a book and interviewing actual people. Now, most of my books have involved some research, but none more than Out of Nowhere. It's set in the imaginary town of Enniston, Maine. And Out of Nowhere, however, is fiction inspired by actual events which have taken place in the city of Lewiston, Maine, which is about 40 minutes away from my home in Brunswick. Lewiston, for those of you who have not been here, is a former textile mill town located on the Androscoggin River. It's home to Bates College. It's right down the road from Lisbon, Maine, which is where we have our annual Moxie Festival. It's also where author Stephen King went to high school. And Lewiston is also the most Franco-American city in the United States. The vast majority of Lewiston's residents are descended from French Canadians who emigrated from Quebec to work in the mills. And as a result, it's also a very Catholic city. There are only 4 Catholic basilica in the whole US. These are very big cathedrals. And this one, the Basilica of Saints Peter and Paul in Lewiston, was built in large part from nickel and dime donations from French and Canadian immigrant factory workers. That is what Lewiston is today. Very, very Catholic, very Franco. I also like to share this photo because it really encapsulates another part of where Lewiston is today. In the background, you see the spires of a Christian church. On the left, that old 3-story green walk-up, those are apartments which used to house mill workers but are now filled with Somali families. And crossing the street, you see a group of Muslim Somali girls. And this is because about 20 years ago, Lewiston began experiencing a large and unexpected arrival of thousands of Somali refugees. Now, at the time that this was happening, I was living in Brunswick, was raising my family and writing, I think, my second novel. And in the interest of full disclosure, I will confess, I don't think at the time I could have identified Somalia on a map. I could not have begun to imagine why so many African, Muslim, non-English speaking families were flocking to a somewhat economically depressed, very Catholic former mill town in one of the coldest and definitely the whitest states in the nation. All I did know, and this was from reading the newspaper, was that all these new arrivals were reportedly putting a strain on schools and services in Lewiston, and that the mayor, pictured here, a guy named Laurier Raymond, wrote a letter to the editor of the Lewiston Sun Journal addressing the Somali community and asking them to please tell their friends and relatives to stop coming, that Lewiston was maxed out, and this sparked all sorts of counter letters and hard feelings and protests outside City Hall, which led to more media coverage, which inevitably led to this group, the so-called World Church of the Creator, which is not a church at all, but a white supremacist group whose leader at the time was in prison for killing a federal judge. This group announced that they were going to travel to Lewiston to hold a rally, in quotes, in support of white people, which was all just code for making trouble, which of course was the last thing that Lewiston needed at the time. The good news is that a group in Lewiston formed. It was called the Many and One Coalition, and this was a group that decided to hold a counter-protest, a peace rally, if you will, on the same day that the white supremacists were scheduled to come. Thousands of people from all over the state mobilized to come to this rally. And my family and I drove up from Brunswick to attend on what might have been one of the coldest days that I can remember in Maine, and that's saying something. We managed to get there in time to get a seat in the auditorium at Bates College before it filled to capacity and the fire marshal had to close the doors. Still, despite the cold, people stayed. They ringed the outside of the building, and speeches that were being made inside were piped outdoors so everyone could stand and listen to it. And this was when I heard the first of many stories that led to my writing out of nowhere. Because after the politicians and the local leaders got up, the students from Lewiston High School started coming to the mic. And a lot of these were refugee kids, most of them reading haltingly from index cards because their English wasn't great. And before an audience of about 5,000 people, they told their coming to America stories. They talked about drought and civil war that led to violence in their country that had forced them to flee. They talked about walking for days with their families to Kenya, where the United Nations had set up refugee camps. They talked about how these camps were rough places. Girls and women could not walk alone. You spent most of your day collecting water from spigots. There were rushes to trucks in order to get food. And at night, there were people who would wander in and out of the camp and make trouble. But they also told me about how if you stayed in the camps, there was hope. Because if you got in line, your family could wait to be vetted and ultimately chosen for relocation to another country. Now, this takes a long time because when you run with nothing but the clothing on your back, you don't have time to grab your file cabinets and your birth certificates. These kids had no documentation whatsoever, and the vetting process took a long time. They told me that some of them had lived in the camps for 10 to 12 years before they were finally chosen. This is a picture of the Dadaab refugee camp complex today. It is one of the biggest in the world, with more than 200,000 people in Kenya waiting to be vetted and selected for relocation to another country. And that day at that rally, I listened as these kids got up to the mic and talked about what it was like to finally be chosen, to learn that you're coming to America, to find out you had a new home, what it was like to feel safe, have a permanent place to live, get up every day and go to school. All the simple things that all of us in the audience that day took as a matter of course. So needless to say, I left the rally that day inspired by those young people and wondering if I could write a young adult novel based on what was happening in Lewiston. In retrospect, I realized what a dumb, naive idea that was. Now remember, I'm the woman who couldn't find Somalia on a map. I knew nothing about their culture, very little about Islam. And frankly, I was walking into a hornet's nest because peace rally aside, and it went very well, only about 35 members of the World Church of the Creator turned out, and they sort of scurried out of town because there were so many thousands of peace protesters that were in town. Nevertheless, emotions in Lewiston were running very high. But as the saying goes, fools rush in. So off I went into Lewiston, trying to set up appointments to interview people and write a book. And all I can say about that was, it did not go well. Most of the adults that I met were either defensive, or they had an agenda, or they didn't trust what my motives were. Who was I? Why was I trying to write this story? Many of the important people I needed to meet wouldn't return my calls. The principal at the high school wouldn't invite me into the building. But finally, I struck gold, and I was introduced to two Lewiston boys who broke this story wide open for me. They were Johnny McDonough and Chabot Saban. At the time, they were two seniors at Lewiston High School who met in middle school and now played varsity soccer on the same team. They were the Lewiston Blue Devils, and they were high school ball players. That is Johnny in the upper left-hand corner. He is a Lewiston native. Chabot, in the lower right-hand corner, picture with his mom, had arrived in Maine after first living in Georgia. Before that, he'd spent 12 years at Dadaab. And these boys were friends and teammates. And they answered all my questions. And more importantly than that, they opened their hearts to me and they shared their stories. They trusted me to hear their stories, and they trusted me to then retell their stories in some way. This was when I needed to use all of my empathy and my active listening skills to really get to the truth of what their experience, their profound experience together was like. And it was a challenge, being the middle-aged woman who knew so little that I was. But these boys were very, very open with me, and they shared a lot. They also had a very good sense of humor about me and took a lot of my stupid questions for granted. They told me things like what their pasta parties were like, what it was like just going through the halls, what was it like in the cafeteria, especially Chabot, who met with me individually a lot and just walked around Lewiston with me. We'd pop into the Somali stores, we would visit his mosque, we would eat his favorite foods, many of which ended up in the story. This, for example, is halwa. It's a traditional Somali treat. I can only describe it as saying it's like orange gummy bears to the 10th factorial. This stuff is sweet, but boy, he loved it. He also introduced me to sambusas, which are these wonderful little triangle-shaped pastries that are filled with savory meat. They're delicious. He also introduced me to goat. He's quite a goat fan. I tried goat, and yes. What I also realized when I spent time with these boys was that soccer was a particular place where, I'm going to go back up to their picture. Soccer was a particular place where the refugee kids and the American kids were coming together in an extraordinary way. You see, the refugee kids played soccer all the time, all the time. They played all the time in America, and when they had been in the refugee camp, they played all the time there, and they were awesome. They were so good that they were transforming the Lewiston team, which had never been much of a soccer powerhouse. So Johnny and Chabot, who were very proud of their soccer team, suggested that I give their coach a call. This is a guy named Mike McGraw. He had grown up in Lewiston. He was currently a biology teacher, and he had been coaching soccer there for about 30 years. And this is me pictured with Mike McGraw. Mike was the other person who shared stories with me and helped me break this book open. He met with me at a picnic table outside the high school, probably because the principal still didn't want me in the building. And remember what I told you about Lewiston was no stranger to immigration and all those French-speaking newcomers from Quebec who had moved to the city? Well, despite his Irish name, Mike McGraw's grandmother is Franco, and she had worked in the mills. And like the Somali kids who were dealing with all sorts of prejudice and challenges because of their religion and lack of English, the Quebecois had endured similar challenges when they came to America. And Mike had grown up hearing those stories, which made him probably the perfect person to coach that Lewiston team at precisely that moment in time, because Mike empathized with those boys and he created an even playing field for all of them. His attitude was, you work hard, you respect each other and the rules of the game, you have a place on my team. Now that may sound simple enough, but when Somali kids started taking the spots which native Lewiston kids thought they were in line for, Mike took some heat from a lot of parents. They did back down as Lewiston began beating all their old rivals. Here's how Mike described it to me. He said, in Lewiston, we were known for playing thug soccer, basically taking our skills on the ice hockey arena and transferring them to the soccer field. But when these refugee kids joined the team, we started playing a whole new finesse game. Excuse me. The Lewiston Blue Devils today are almost always now regional champs, and in the past few years have either won or been in the finals for the Maine State Soccer Championships. Now, when I wrote my book was published in 2013. The research that I was doing is probably 2011, 2010. At that time, the team was ascendant, but not yet dominating. This picture here is from 2015, when the boys had won their regional championship for the first time. When I was researching the book, I had to look really hard to find kids whose English was good enough to tell me their stories. At the time that I was meeting kids, only a handful were in upper level classes or college bound. Now what I'm going to do is just catch you up with Lewiston today before we can return to the book and sort of get into more question and answer and a conversation. But today, immigrant and refugee kids are graduating from Lewiston High School at or above the same rate as their native Maine counterparts. Somali girls are thriving. When I first started poking around Lewiston, most of the girls I met were required to go right home after school to help with the little kids and cook, or they could do homework. What I'm seeing now is the Somali girls are managing teams. Some of them are playing sports. They're excelling academically, and many are applying to college and attending college. Somali women are taking notice in Lewiston. This is Zamzam Mohammed. She is a refugee mother of 5. She works at the local hospital. She is the liaison between the Somali community and the police, and she is the first member of the Somali community to be elected to the school board. This is Safia Khalid. She is only 24 years old. She's the first member of the Somali community to be elected to the city council. This is one of my favorites. This is Baro Hassan. Baro was a Lewiston High School girl, and she was like, you know, hijab doesn't have to be boring. I can design all sorts of clothing that we are still, you know, sticking with the practices of our religion and covering up, but we can also look good. And so Baro created an entire line of hijab and Somali clothing. And she then applied to Mount Ida College in Boston and went there and got a degree in fashion merchandising. And this is her with all of her girlfriends modeling her designs. You're probably wondering, however, whatever happened with the soccer. So let's scroll to 2015. So this is 2 years after Out of Nowhere was published. And Lewiston found themselves in the boys' Class A soccer championship final against Maine soccer powerhouse Scarborough, which, if you know anything about Maine sports or Maine boys sports, Scarborough is quite the dominant team. They have lots of money, lots of students, and they have lots of state championship trophies in sports. That matchup was billed as David and Goliath, with Goliath being Scarborough, pictured there with their scary mohawk hairdos, which scared all of us, and the Somali, mostly refugee kids on the soccer team who had their sort of past hand-me-down uniforms, and they just looked like little skinny kids in comparison to these big Scarborough boys. I remember sitting in the stands with my husband watching this game unfold. And there was a man sitting behind me, and I heard him say, geez, I feel like I am watching a bunch of Maine high school boys play a World Cup team. That was the difference in the way they played. To Scarborough's credit, they played great defense, and they held them back so that at halftime it was 0-0. But the Lewiston Blue Devils completely dominated that game. They played that finesse game that Mike McGraw had been telling me about. So many touches, so many passes. They had possession almost the whole game. And you just waited for, was somebody going to score? Meanwhile, on the Lewiston side of the stands, you could see all these people banging pots, shaking tambourines, screaming, "Go Blue Devils, go Blue Devils." And on the Scarborough side, they had a pep band. They had millions of fans. They had gigantic black and red flags flapping in the breeze. And they were screaming, "USA, USA," which was kind of curious because weren't we all from the USA? There was a lot riding on this game, is the way I'll put it. But then finally this happened. That fellow in the blue uniform is Abdi Sharif Hassan. And somewhere in the second half, there was a struggle for the ball. And he got that pink cleat on a ball, which then hit the knee of a Scarborough player. And then the ball went in the net. It was an own goal against Scarborough. And Lewiston won 1-0. It was their first state championship in 33 years. And I have to tell you, it was an emotional outcome because this town and these kids had been through so much. And that victory wasn't just their victory. I don't know about you, but when old dudes start to cry, it just breaks me completely. So these pictures of Mike McGraw, they always choke me up. These kids took the trophy over to the other side and everybody was petting it and touching it. It was just a remarkable celebration because these kids had achieved something not just for themselves, but for their entire community. This is sort of an iconic picture from that day. I took it from the newspaper. Mike at one point was crossing over to the field and I saw something I'd never seen before. He got a standing ovation from the people in the stands because they all knew he was the right man at the right time for these boys. And he made something happen, not just for them, but for that whole town. Soccer and this team has been part of this community's connecting and healing in a very profound way that I really can't underestimate. They've gone on to win the state championship 3 more times. They won in 2015, 17, and 18. The years they didn't win, they at least were in the finals, and they almost won. I'm going to stop the slides now. Let's see if I can do that. Here we go. I'm going to stop that. And I'm back. Okay. I think it's fair to say that writing out of nowhere took me on an emotional journey, and it connected me to people that I never knew existed. It presented me with daunting challenges as I had to overcome my limited knowledge and experiences in order to write an authentic story that would ring true not only for those who read it, but also for those who saw their words and their stories reflected back at them, a true story exchange, if you will. There's no question that active listening, openness, refraining from judgment, and striving for connection, all the components of radical empathy, helped me write this book. I don't think writing this book would have been possible if I hadn't had some of that training. I've been talking at you for a long time, and I would love to hear what you have to say, or answer any questions, or just turn this into some more of a conversation. But needless to say, that was a story and a book that meant a lot to me, and I still get a real kick out of going to Lewiston and watching those soccer games. Still pretty exciting.
Thanks, Maria. Does anybody have a question? You want to put your hand up or unmute yourself? We're kind of a small group.
Do we get to call on people? No. And ask them questions? Sarah raised her hand.
Oh, okay, Sarah, yep. I'm gonna unmute you, Sarah. Can I unmute her? There. There you go.
I have all of these questions. This is such a fabulous talk. It's such a fabulous time. I put my first question in the chat, but now I can't even find it. But I'm just wondering how the Black Lives Matter movement / awareness affected your writing process, or writing circles.
I would say that at this point is definitely, because I'm going to put that in recent time, it's affected my reading profoundly. If I had a, let's reach over here. I'm going through this one. Where is my Ibram Kendi book? I'm reading this. I have completely, my reading has completely shifted to trying to be reading books that are written by people of color and Black authors, and reading as an attempt to better understand communities that have something to teach me. Reading as if it is a story exchange, and I'm trying to empathize very deeply with the story that I'm hearing. Like, if I had to repeat it back, if I could absorb it and connect it with my own feelings and emotions, how would I go about doing that? How it's affecting my own writing, I don't know yet.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
Like, this is just so relevant to where I am right now, struggling to figure out how, as an amateur, very amateur white writer, how I don't want to stop writing, but I also don't want to be part of the noise that Black voices have to overcome. So I'm just wondering, are there limits to the approach of radical empathy in storytelling? And for instance, how do you interact with the Own Voices movement?
Oh boy.
I'm sorry, it's tough.
That's an enormous, the anvil of that question is just, it's really hard. It's really fraught. It's very, very difficult. All right, so I can just, hold on one second. Let me just go and grab, where is it? Oh, never mind, I don't see it. So my other book that just came out is called How to Build a Heart. My editor is billing it as an Own Voices. They're billing it as an Own Voices because my mother is Latina. My father's Irish. I didn't grow up speaking Spanish. I look nothing like my blonde-haired, blue-eyed father, but I don't speak Spanish like my mother. I wrote a story about a girl who struggles with that. It's where she struggles with identity issues. She struggles with where is her actual home. And throughout the book, I weave a lot of the Spanish sayings that I did pick up from my mother. For example, the book begins with the line, Dime con quien andes y te diré quién eres. Tell me who you're hanging out with and I'll tell you who you are. That's one of the first lines of the book. It's the last line of the book. And the book follows the progression of that arc as this character comes to learn who she is based on how she defines home and family. The whole time I was writing this book, I worried, am I being a fraud? Can I write a book like this? Because I'm not trying to be Latina, but I am trying to write about my experience of knowing these stories from my mother. It's fraud. It's an absolute minefield. And the entire time that I was writing this book, I was a wreck, worried about how the critics were going to accept this book. It's been fine because, again, I stayed in my lane of writing what I know and connecting with what I know is emotionally true. When I was going to write Out of Nowhere, my agent took me aside and said, Maria, do not write this from the point of view of a Somali girl. Don't even go there. And I realized, no way could I do it. I could, as there was only so far that I was going to be able to go to write authentically. So I ended up, the risk that I took in that book, I wrote from the point of view of an 18-year-old Maine boy. So again, not me, but I had an 18-year-old Maine boy living in my house at the time. That was my son. And so I had those voices in my head. I had the language, I had the lingo, and I also had somebody who was a sensitivity reader. He read a lot of it for me, and he would give me lots of feedback. So what I would say is, We have to write what we know and connect with what we know is emotionally true, but we have to know when we've gone as far as we can go. We got to get it right. I also think too, that if we only stay in limited lanes, well, isn't that what writing and creativity is about? Is writing what you want to know, getting to know something different, having the freedom to create. So Colin McCann, who started Narrative 4, he writes from the point of view of Frederick Douglass. He's an Irish guy. He writes from the point of view of George Mitchell. That's what he's telling us in Narrative 4. If you really, truly, radically empathize with your character, you can write from that point of view. You can create those kinds of characters. I think you have to be kind of brilliant like Colin McCann to do it well, but I think you can do it.
Thank you so much. I know it was a really tough question. I'll let other people ask you questions, but this is where my head is right now. So thank you very much.
Are you, Sarah, are you a writer? Are you working on stuff right now?
I am writing stuff. I am very amateur. I'm a science fiction author, and I'm trying to write in inclusive Black female voices. And I'm just really struggling because Black Lives Matter has completely made me think maybe I'm not equipped to write this. Maybe I'm being noise. I'm just really in a funk over I think it's so important for us to amplify Black voices, and I'm wondering how to do that inside of my local Hanover white community. I'm not very well connected, so I'm not trying to imply that there aren't amazing Black voices. I'm just isolated.
Yeah. No, I hear what you're saying, especially, you know, I live in the whitest state. So it's really hard to figure out how do we do the right thing? How do we make change? For me, at least, and I'd be curious to know how the rest of you are responding to this now too. I feel like I have a lot to learn. So for me, it's the stack of reading. And I know that somehow that's going to filter down into my writing and my work. But right now, I just feel like I'm catching up. Jane, we have to unmute her. And there you go.
Thank you. So when you were talking about, you know, what your agent said about not writing from the perspective of a Somali girl, it made me think of like All American Boys, and when Jason Reynolds and Brendan Kiley wrote, you know, each wrote from their own voice. And I wondered if that's something you've thought about, you know, as a place you might want to move into, you know, given that, you know, we are trying to like decenter whiteness and center Blackness and BIPOC voices much more in a literature.
Yeah, it's interesting because Mary knows I gave Mary a list of resources to share, and in that list of resources is All American Boys. And have you seen their lecture at the Library of Congress? Oh, I just think all teachers need to show that lecture to kids. They're so wonderful, those two, and they're both so.
I saw them at a book festival at our school.
Oh.
Yeah, we hosted them a few years ago, and it was like not a very big group, and I was like, oh my God, like everybody should be here. They're just remarkable.
You're lucky to be with them when there's not a big group. Most of the time I've seen them, you know, the audience is packed, so there's not a chance to get anywhere near them. Oh no, they're rock stars. Yeah, and I think that both of them, you know, they did what they did because they didn't want to appropriate the other's voice. They wrote from their own experience, and they wrote what they knew. So that said, so there's a gal named Terry Farish who wrote a book called The Good Braider. And it's about Sudanese refugee who comes to Portland. Now, and I think Terry did a beautiful job with this. She met a lot of girls who were rape survivors. She traveled to refugee camps in Africa. I mean, she did stuff I never did. And she also wrote the book in blank verse. And I think when you write a novel in verse, it helps you from dealing with the limitations of a character's English, accent, all that sort of thing. I thought Terry did a gorgeous job, and she's, you know, a white woman my age, but she did it. I think she did it really, really well. So I don't think we should, I don't know. I mean, I wish there was a writer of color right here in this group right now to counter what I'm saying, but I don't think we should be afraid to necessarily step out of our lane. I just think we have to be really, really careful about doing it right. And I know my own limitations. I could not have done what Terry did, but she pulled it off. I think she did a good job. Anybody else?
I wanted to ask, you were saying,
I just wanted to mention that, and I'm not going to remember the actual name of it, but on Sunday, there was a really good piece on NPR in Hidden Brain, and it was about an author who wrote a book, and she was writing it from the point of view of a Vietnamese child, and she was white, and that she went back and she rewrote the book from a Southern point of view. And anyway, it's Hidden Brain, and I've got people's emails, and I can send that, because Maria has also given us a nice list of resources, and I'll include that on there. But it's exactly this conversation about appropriating other people's cultures, and how do you do that. And he did a great job of sort of showing both sides of that. It was really well done. Yeah.
Jennifer, were you going to say something?
yeah, I wanted to ask more about, you said something about getting to know your character and hearing their voice. And I just wondered if you had any like specifics about how you get there, because to me that seems like the fun part, if you could get there. But
yeah, there's also, I think a lot of times you just have to do a lot of tricks. I say to my son is a writer too, and I say, there's all the things that we have to write that nobody else should read, and it's what ultimately gets us to the final draft of our story. And for me, that has to do with a lot of the note taking that I do as I'm developing my characters. So some of the tricks that you can do is write letters from your character's point of view to their friends. Interview your characters. Gosh golly, one of the things that I do with the kids is I'll ask them questions, literally, ask your character, what does your character need? What does your character want? Ask your character, if you had to say, I am, boom, and do a 10-minute free write of all the things that I am. And you're thinking as if you were that character. So there's all sorts of just games you can play as if the character was a real person and you were interviewing them. And then you do that every day, all of a sudden you're going to have a sense of who that character is, and who their friends are, and what they would do in a given situation. Then what we do is we spend some time getting to know a character, and then we will sort of distribute, everybody in the room will get different characters, maybe 3, but we'll use the same prompt, and we'll have the different characters respond to the prompt. And you see how different characters do completely different things because of who they are. And you've just, you've gotten to know them.
May I ask a question?
So I really enjoyed that little video in the beginning, and Jane indicated to me in the chat that it's something that you show to your middle schoolers, that video that we saw, Jane. Yeah.
The empathy one.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, okay. Yeah. Elizabeth, what were you going to say?
Well, when you're talking about interviewing, I thought of your background in journalism, and I was wondering, the different genres you've written in. Why did you change? How do they affect what you write now? How does, can you say more about what you learned from journalism that you apply to fiction? It's just really interesting that the interviewing part, that you're interviewing kind of imaginary people in a way, in some ways there.
Yeah. I think, well, one thing was that having been a reporter, the research part of books is fun for me. I don't mind doing that. And I tend to interrogate people whenever I meet them anyway. I'm very nosy. So yeah, so doing research has never been a problem. Also, most of my background was in radio. So you write radio very differently than you write for print. You have to write the way people speak, because you're going to be reading it out loud. And so as a result, I find that dialogue is something that comes easily to me and I enjoy doing. I know some people really struggle with dialogue. Oh, my characters could talk all day. I struggle with the descriptive part, like the narrative bridges between the dialogue is the hard part for me. I could just put them in a room and have them all chatter away endlessly. So I think that's what helped me with my news background, was writing for radio.
Yeah, thanks.
I do miss radio. I listen to This American Life every once in a while, and I think, gosh, that stuff's great. I wish I could do that. There's just, you don't get paid to do radio. That's one of the problems. But I always ask people, because we're starting to run out of time, I always ask people what they are reading. And I'll share with you what I'm reading right now, which is I am reading the Ibram X. Kendi book, Stamped from the Beginning. I cannot put that down. It's absolutely blowing my mind. And then the other book that I'm reading right now is How to Be an Anti-Racist, which one of my book groups was saying, should we read White Fragility or should we read How to Be an Anti-Racist? And I've read White Fragility and I said, oh, no, please, this one. And he's amazing. He's, again, I just feel like I'm learning so much from him. But what are you all reading? Anything good that I should miss?
I'm reading that How to Be an Anti-Racist right now too.
Okay. You are too?
I'm reading a couple of things. I'm actually, because I'm in the middle of writing a paper for a graduate class on trauma. So I'm reading The Body Keeps the Score. And then I'm reading a memoir that someone wrote called All the Silent Spaces, about surviving an assault. And then I'm sort of using the research from The Body Keeps the Score from Bessel van der Kolk, who's this trauma expert, and a lot of research. And I'm sort of analyzing the memoir and backing it up with all this research. So it's actually due tomorrow, so it's on my mind.
Oh my gosh, okay. What is that? When Stars Are Scattered. Oh, who's the author?
So so my daughter ran and grabbed this as soon as she heard what you were talking about. She was like, this is about Kenya and about the refugee camps. And
oh my gosh.
It's by Victoria Jameson and Omar Mohammed.
Okay.
So it looks like someone's writing it with someone who is there, I'm assuming. She wrote Roller Girl. So yeah, she was kind of excited to grab that book.
Oh, wonderful. I just wrote down the title. Oh, and there's actual pictures of people from the back. Oh, isn't this marvelous? I have not heard of this book. Who published it?
That's out of the library, right? I mean, this is we're going to do a whole page through.
Sorry, this is my book.
Are those pictures of the refugee camps you just showed me?
Yeah.
They look just like the pictures that you were showing.
Oh my gosh, look at this.
Like miles of tents and yeah, it's really cool.
I know. Yeah, and it was so funny too, because I would chat with some of the girls and they would be really resentful of their brothers. And they'd say, we had to go to the water spigots and haul water all day, and so-and-so and Mohammed and Ibrahim, they were just playing soccer all day, just playing soccer. And then they get to the United States and it's the same thing. They're just outside playing soccer all the time. Well, the end result is they're incredible. So they're still getting all that credit for playing soccer. But their sisters are doing really well in school. So.
I'm part of a Richmond book club. I've got that one on hold. I actually just had to buy a second copy of that for the teen room because it's going out so much. But I'm reading High in the Sky, because there's a bunch of 6th graders that are reading it. It's kind of a hybrid, and it's about, I can't remember if they moved to Australia. And then this is the book actually I took out because of that show, the Hidden Brain. And this is the book, The True History of Lindy B. Hawkins. And she rewrote it. She started to write it from a Vietnamese point of view, and then she rewrote it from a Southern girl's point of view because she didn't feel like she should do that. But anyway, this was the Hidden Brain conversation, which I really recommend listening to. It's really quite good.
Yeah, oh, that's wonderful. Very good. Well, thank you for these wonderful suggestions. Does anybody have, oh, you've got another one. What's that? What's that? We have to unmute her. Can I?
Oh, yeah. Jane, you're muted.
This is Me and White Supremacy by Layla Syed.
Oh.
So we did an Instagram challenge. Our entire faculty and staff is reading this. And I do a lot of this diversity work at our school. So if you're looking to like really work on yourself, it's like a 28-day, like, it's pretty intense in terms of like just understanding your whiteness. But then I'm also reading, do you know The Girl Who Smiled Beads? I just started it. It's so good. She was a Rwandan refugee, and she and her sister fled the genocide in 1994. And I just started it, and I can't put it down. It's incredible.
Oh,
So,
wow.
yeah, it just made Maria, it seems like something, you know, that like, I'm sure there are aspects of her story that are, you know, really similar to, you know, the characters and the, you know, the people you met.
Yeah. Oh, it's wonderful.
Yeah.
These are great suggestions. Thank you. Thank you. I'll share them with you. Thanks, everybody. And thank you, Jared, for all of your help. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. This was fabulous.
Nice to meet you. Bye.
Buddy.